Replacement theology is stupid. As the seventh item on my summary of the Old Testament message that I gave you in the April 2017 issue of this newsletter, I said this. 7. When Jesus Christ was baptized by John and accepted the terms of the new covenant, he became corporate Israel, the heir of the promise. Therefore, when he died, he atoned for the sins of corporate Israel by suffering under the curses of the Mosaic covenant. But because of his obedience to the terms of the new covenant, God was obligated to fulfill the promise and resurrect him so that he could inherit what was promised to Adam and Eve, creation in the image and likeness of God. I have also explained these things in Not All Israel is Israel and in the pages of the Voice of Elijah newsletter and the Voice of Elijah update over the past quarter of a century. Satan has made a concerted effort to represent what I teach as replacement theology. The truth is, I have never, and will never, claim the church somehow replaced corporate Israel as the covenant people of God. That is not what happened. After Jeremiah and Ezekiel told corporate Israel that God planned to make a new covenant with the individual members of corporate Israel continued on as it had previously, but Jesus Christ became corporate Israel when John the Baptist offered the individual members of corporate Israel a new covenant relationship to God, and they were cut off from corporate Israel. But to understand how that happened, you need to be aware of the things I explained in Not All Israel is Israel. I summarized those things this way. 4. Under the terms of the law of Moses, an individual member of corporate Israel could be cut off from corporate Israel. Various parts of that law demanded that ultimate punishment. If the sons of Israel were aware that someone had violated one of those, they were expected to execute the individual and thereby erase his name from Israel. Even if they did not do that, God would cut him off from corporate Israel. That is, he would erase the individual's name from the census book of Israel that he maintained. For that reason God alone knew who had been cut off from corporate Israel, and no one else had the right to say anyone was still a member of corporate Israel. I have already explained these things in Not All Israel is Israel. The truth is, Jesus Christ did not replace corporate Israel. The Jews lost their position in corporate Israel when God cut them off from it, just as John the Baptist told them he was already in the process of doing, and just as I explained in Not All Israel is Israel. Matthew chapter 3, verses 1 through 12, HSSB. Now in those days, John the Baptist arrives, preaching in the desert of Judea and saying, "Apologize, for the kingdom of the heavens has drawn near." For this individual is the one who was spoken of via the prophet Isaiah, who says, "The voice of one who is crying out in the desert. Prepare the way of his majesty. Make his well-worn paths a straightway." Now John himself had his clothing made out of camel's hair, and a belt made of leather was around his loins, but what he ate was locusts and wild honey. At that time, Jerusalem, as well as all Judea and the whole area around the Jordan, began going out to him, and those who were admitting the truth concerning their sins were being baptized by him in the Jordan River. But after seeing many of the Pharisees and Sadducees coming for his baptism, he said to them, "You descendants of vipers, who gave you an indication that you should flee from the anger that is going to come? Therefore, produce fruit worthy of your apology, and do not assume that you can say to yourselves, 'We have Abraham as a father,' for I tell you that the living God can raise up children for Abraham out of these stones. But the axe is already laid at the root of the trees. Therefore, every tree that is not producing exceptionally good fruit is going to be cut off and thrown into a fire." On the one hand, I am baptizing you with water for an apology, but on the other hand, The one who is going to come after me is mightier than I, whose sandals I am not worthy of consideration to carry. He will baptize you with a Holy Spirit and fire, whose winnowing fork is in his hand, and he will cause his threshing floor to be cleaned thoroughly, and he will gather his wheat into the storehouse, but he will burn up the chaff in an unquenchable fire. The very essence of John's ministry is summed up in the following verse, where he parabolically depicts the individual members of corporate Israel as trees. Matthew chapter 3, verse 10, HSSB. But the axe is already laid at the root of the trees. Therefore, every tree that is not producing exceptionally good fruit is going to be cut off and thrown into a fire. If you were not aware that the prophets and apostles repeatedly used the parabolic image of a tree to depict a man, you obviously haven't paid all that much attention to what they say. The following is a good example of how Jesus used that parabolic image to weave the parabolic statements of the prophets into the parables he told. In it, he not only parabolically depicts men as trees, he also parabolically depicts himself and Satan as two houses that will face the horror of events that are yet to come in our day. Matthew chapter 7, verses 15 through 27, HSSB. Beware of the false prophets, who come to you in sheep's clothing, but are avaricious wolves on the inside. You can recognize them by their fruits. They do not by any means cull bunches of grapes from thorns or figs from thistles. So also, every good tree produces exceptionally good fruit, but the rotten tree produces nasty fruit. A good tree cannot produce nasty fruit, neither does a rotten tree produce exceptionally good fruit. Every tree that is not producing exceptionally good fruit is going to be cut off and thrown into a fire. So then you can, indeed, recognize them by their fruits. Not everyone who says Your Majesty to me will come into the kingdom of the heavens, but only the one who acts in accordance with the will of my Father, who is in the heavens. Many will say to me on that day, Your Majesty, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do a lot of supernaturally powerful things in your name? And then I will acknowledge the truth about them, that I never knew you. You who are committing the lawless deed, depart from me. Therefore, anyone who hears these, my words, and acts in accordance with them will be like a sensible man who built his house on the rock. And the rain came down, and the rivers came up, and the winds blew, and they prostrated themselves in that house. And it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. And anyone who hears these, my words, and does not act in accordance with them, will be like a stupid man who built his house on the sand. And the rain came down, and the rivers came up, and the winds blew, and they stumbled in that house, and it fell, and its fall was tremendous. In that passage, Jesus is mocking the fools among us who have not a clue as to how he became not only the house of Judah, but also the house of Israel, when all the other Jews were cut off from those two houses. But his ridicule of such fools fairly drips with sarcasm when he parabolically depicts himself as the vine that is corporate Israel. John chapter 15, verses 1 through 7, HSSB. I am the vine that is real, and my Father is the cultivator. Every cutting in me that is not bearing fruit, he is going to take it away, and anything that is bearing fruit, he is going to clean it up, so that it may bear much more fruit. You are already clean because of the word that I have spoken to you. You must remain in me, and I will remain in you. Just as the cutting cannot bear fruit of its own accord if it does not remain on the vine, so also neither can you, if you do not remain in me. I am the vine, you are the cuttings. The one who remains in me, and I in him, this individual is going to bear a lot of fruit, because apart from me, you cannot do anything at all. If anyone does not remain in me, he has been thrown out and shriveled up like the cutting, and they are going to gather them up, and throw them into the fire, and they are going to be burned. If you remain in me, and the statements I make remain in you, request whatever it may be that you want, and it will be done for you. If you are not familiar with what the prophets tell us about the Messiah who will become corporate Israel, what Jesus says in that passage will elude you, so let me point it out for you. Here is one of the passages in the prophets that Jesus had in mind when he made those statements about himself as corporate Israel. Isaiah chapter 5, verses 1 through 30, my interim translation. Please let me sing about my beloved, my loved one's song about his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard, a son of oil, on a mountain peak. And he tilled him and threw out his stones. Then he planted him with a productive vine, and he built a tower in his midst. And he even hewed out a wine vat in him. Then he waited expectantly for him to make grapes, but he made stinking gourds. So now, inhabitants of Jerusalem and man of Judah, please judge between me and my vineyard. What is there yet to do to my vineyard that I have not done in him? Why did I wait eagerly for him to make grapes, and he made stinking gourds? So now let me make known to you what I am going to do to my vineyard. I am going to remove his hedge, and it will become something to be burned. I am going to make a breach in his wall, and he will become what is trampled. Then I will designate him for ruination. He will not be pruned, and he will not be hoed. So briars and thorns will come up, and I will give a command to the thunderheads not to cause rain to fall on him. Because the vineyard of his supreme majesty is the house of Israel, and the man of Judah is the plant of those who enjoy him. So he has waited expectantly for a decision based on truth, but guess what? There has been a breach of trust for a declaration of not guilty, but guess what? There has been an outcry. Woe to those who cause a house to make contact with a house. They will bring a field together with a field until there is no place, and you alone dwell in the midst of the land. His supreme majesty has spoken in my hearing. Many big and good houses will most definitely be devastated, without any inhabitants. Because 10 acres of vineyard will make 1 bath, and a homer of seed will make an ephah. Woe to those who get up early in the morning, they pursue liquor. Those who delay at twilight, wine hotly pursues them. So their celebratory feasts are lyre and lute, tambourine and flute, and wine, but they will not look at the deed his majesty has done, so they will not see what his hands have made. Therefore, my people will go into exile because of a lack of knowledge, and his glory, adult males will be hungry, and his multitude will be dehydrated, thirsty. Therefore, the sea of El has enlarged her soul, and she has opened her mouth wide, without limit. But her splendor will go down, even her multitude and her clamor and the jubilation in her. Then an Adam will be cast down, and a man will be brought down. But the eyes of those who are exalted will also be brought down. Then his supreme majesty will be exalted by a decision based on the truth, and the holy God will be made holy by a declaration of not guilty. Then sheep will graze in accordance with the word they have, but those who are residing temporarily will consume the ruins of fattened sheep. Woe to those who draw out the reprehensible activity with the ropes of the deception, and sin as with the cords of the cart. The ones who say let him be quick, let him make what he does happen quickly so that we may see, and let the plan of the Holy One of Israel come close. and let it come to pass so that we may know. Woe to those who tell the bad person, good, and the good person, bad. Those who turn darkness into light, and light into darkness. Those who turn bitter into sweet, and sweet into bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes, and those who have understanding right in front of their face. Woe to gibbors for drinking wine, and men of an entourage for mixing liquor. Those who declare a guilty person not guilty because of a bribe, and remove the declaration of not guilty of those who are not guilty. Therefore, as a tongue of fire consumes straw, and dry grass slacks off into a flame, their root will be like rottenness, and their blossom will go up like a dusty powder, because they have rejected the teaching of His supreme majesty, and they have treated the statement of the Holy One of Israel with contempt, with the result that the anger of His majesty has become inflamed against His people. So He will stretch out His hand against him, and He will viciously strike him. Then the mountains will be disturbed and their corpses will be like rubbish within the streets. During all this, His anger will not turn back, and His hand will still be outstretched. Then He will lift up an ensign for the Gentiles from a long ways away, and He will whistle to Him from the end of the earth. Then guess what? He will come quickly, swiftly. There is not anyone weary, and there is not anyone stumbling in Him. He will not doze, and He will not fall asleep, and the binding on His hips will not be opened, and the strap of His sandals will not be pulled away. Whose arrows are sharpened, and all His bows are flexed. The hooves of His horses are considered to be like flintstone, and His wagons like a medicane. He has a roar like a lioness with cubs, but He will roar like the alpha lions. Then He will growl and take hold of something consumable, but He will rescue it, and there will not be anyone who snatches it away. Then He will growl over it on that day, like the growling of the sea, and He will look at the earth, but guess what? Darkness, distress. Even light will be dark in her dense clouds. I don't see how Isaiah could have stated the meaning of his parable any more clearly than he did here. Isaiah chapter 5, verse 7, my interim translation. Because the vineyard of His supreme majesty is the house of Israel, and the man of Judah is the plant of those who enjoy Him. So He has waited expectantly for a decision based on truth, but guess what? There has been a breach of trust, for a declaration of not guilty, but guess what? There has been an outcry. The parabolic image in which corporate Israel is a vineyard, forms the basis for a couple of the parables that Jesus told. Here is Matthew's version of the one in which he quotes a bit of what Isaiah said about corporate Israel as a vineyard. Matthew chapter 21, verses 33 through 46, HSSB. Listen to another comparison. There was a man, an owner of a house, who planted a vineyard and put a hedge around it, and dug out a wine press in it, and built a tower, and rented it out to cultivators, and went abroad. But when the time for the fruits drew near, he sent his slaves to the cultivators to receive its fruits. And after the cultivators took his slaves, they punched one, killed another, threw stones at another. He again sent other slaves, more than the first, and they did the same thing to them. But later, he sent his son to them, saying, "They will pay deference to my son." But when the cultivators saw the son, they said among themselves, "This individual is the heir, come on, we can kill him and have his inheritance." And after taking him, they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those cultivators? They tell him, He will do away with those awfully awful persons, and rent out the vineyard to other cultivators who will pay him for the fruits at their times. Jesus says to them, "Have you never read in the Scriptures, a stone that those who are building completely rejected? This stone has been turned into the head of a corner. This came about from His Majesty, and it is amazing in our eyes. For this reason I tell you that the kingdom of the living God will be taken away from you and given to a nation who produces its fruits. And the one who has fallen on this stone will be shattered, but on whomever it might be that it falls, it will winnow him out." And when the high priests and the Pharisees heard his comparisons, they knew that he was talking about them. Yet while they were looking for him to grab hold of him, they were afraid of the crowds, since they regarded him as a prophet. The following is Mark's version of what Jesus said. He confirms that Jesus was indeed pointing to what Isaiah said when he told that parable. Mark chapter 12, verses 1 through 12, HSSB. Then he began to speak to them in comparisons. A man planted a vineyard and put a hedge around it, and dug out a wine vat, and built a tower, and rented it out to cultivators, and went abroad, and he sent a slave to the cultivators at the time, so that he could receive some of the fruits of the vineyard from the cultivators. And after taking him, they punched him and sent him away empty. Then he sent another slave to them again, and that one they hit on the head and dishonored. So he sent another, and they killed that one, as well as a lot of others, punching some, killing others. He had one more, a beloved son. He sent him to them last, saying that they will pay deference to my son. But those cultivators said to one another, that this individual is the heir. Come on, we can kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. So, after taking him, they killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. Therefore, what will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come back and do away with the cultivators, and give the vineyard to others. Have you not even read this scripture? A stone that those who are building completely rejected? This stone has been turned into the head of a corner. This has come about from His Majesty, and it is amazing in our eyes. Then they were looking for an opportunity to grab hold of him, yet they were afraid of the crowd, for they knew that he had spoken the comparison against them. So, after leaving him, they went away. The part about God taking the vineyard away from the Jewish leaders and giving it to others should convince any rational person that something is going on that they don't understand, but it won't. Maybe Luke will convince them by adding his weight to the evidence. Luke chapter 20, verses 9 through 20, HSSB. And then he began to tell this comparison to the people. Some man planted a vineyard, and rented it out to cultivators, and went abroad for considerable spans of time. And in time, he sent a slave to the cultivators, so that they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard, but the cultivators, after punching him, sent him away empty. Then he added another slave to his workforce to send to them. But after punching and dishonoring that one, they also sent him away empty. Then he added a third slave to his workforce to send to them, but after injuring this individual, they also threw him out. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What should I do? I will send my son, my beloved one. Maybe they will pay deference to this individual." But then, after the cultivators saw him, they were speculating with one another, saying, "This is the heir, we should kill him, so that the inheritance becomes ours." So after throwing him out of the vineyard, they killed him. Therefore, what will the owner of the vineyard do to them? Will he come back and do away with these cultivators and give the vineyard to others? So then, after hearing what he said, they, the high priests, scribes, and elders said, "Certainly not." But then after looking at them intently, he said, "Therefore, what is this that has been written? A stone that those who are building completely rejected, this stone has been turned into the head of a corner. Anyone who has fallen on that stone will be shattered, but on whomever it might be that it falls, it will winnow him out." Then the scribes and the high priests sought to put their hands on him, at that very hour, for they knew that he had spoken this comparison about them, yet they were afraid of the people. So after carefully watching him, they sent infiltrators, who were pretending to be blameless themselves, so that they could take hold of him because of his response to a question, so as to hand him over to the rule and authority of the esteemed leader. Anyone with a lick of common sense should be able to see that God changed things up a bit when he showed up here in this hellhole in which we live. But he did not plan to let corporate Israel off easy. He fully intended to make him pay, and pay dearly. That is exactly what he did when Jesus Christ, corporate Israel, hung on the cross, suffering in sheer agony. But the prophet Jeremiah tells us God imposed the curses of the Old Covenant on corporate Israel, because no one in corporate Israel wanted to know the truth. He describes it this way. Jeremiah chapter 5, verses 1 through 14, my interim translation. "Go out looking in the streets of Jerusalem, so that you see, please, and know, and seek in her plazas. If you can find a man, if there is anyone who is making a decision based on the truth, anyone who is seeking truth, then I will forgive her. But if they say, 'I swear on His Majesty's life,' therefore, they swear a false oath. Your Majesty, are your eyes not for the truth? You viciously struck them, but they were not in torment. You finished them off. They refused to accept admonishment. They made their faces stronger than a crag, they refused to come back. But I said, 'But they are destitute, they are idiots because they do not know the way of His Majesty, a decision based on the truth of their God.' I will go for myself to those who are great, and I will speak to them, because they knew the way of His Majesty, a decision based on the truth of their God. But they have, altogether, broken the yoke. They have snapped the shackles. Therefore, a lion from the forest will viciously attack them, a wolf of the desert plain will vanquish them, a leopard is keeping watch over their cities, everyone who goes out of them will be torn to pieces, because their transgressions are many, their apostasies are numerous. Why would I forgive for this? Your sons abandoned me and swore an oath by something that is not God. When I satisfied them, they committed adultery and ritually cut themselves in the house of Azonah. They are well-fed virile horses, each one cries out shrilly to his neighbor's woman. Should I not levy on account of these things, declares His Majesty, and in such a case, should I not avenge my soul on a Gentile who is like this? Go up on her terraces and destroy, but you must not make a complete end, remove her bunch stems, because they are not His Majesty's. Because the house of Israel and the house of Judah have acted completely deceptively against me, declares His Majesty. They have denied the truth about His Majesty and said, 'Not He. No bad thing will come upon us, and we will not see sword or famine.' But a spirit has the prophets, and the word is not in them. This is what will be done to them. Therefore, this is what His Majesty, the Supreme God, has said, simply because of you speaking this word. Look! I am going to turn my word into fire in your mouth, and this people will be wood, and it will consume them. That should be a warning to those who have no interest in knowing the truth regarding the things God has done, or even the things He is planning to do. For you who do, pay attention. If you were watching, you saw that Jeremiah used the term bunch stems in verse 10. A bunch stem is the stem on a grapevine that produces grapes. Jeremiah is parabolically depicting corporate Israel as a vine, from which God is going to cut off those who have been a part of that vine. Ezekiel is using the same parabolic imagery when he says this. Ezekiel chapter 15, verses 1 through 8, my interim translation. Then the word of His Majesty came to me, saying, Son of Adam, how could the wood of the vine be better than any wood of the slip of a vine, that has been among the trees of the forest? Can wood be taken from it to make something for work, or can they take some of it as a stake on which to hang any container? Guess what? It is going to be put into a fire as something to consume. The fire is going to consume both of its ends, and its middle will be scorched. Will it be useful for work? Guess what? When it is complete, it cannot be made something for work. How much less, when a fire has consumed it and it has been scorched? Can it then still be made something for work? Therefore, this is what my Master, His Majesty, has said, just as the wood of the vine is among the wood of the forest that I have given up to a fire as something to consume, so also I have given up the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So I have set my face against them, they will come out of the fire, but the fire will consume them. Then they will know that I am His Majesty, when I set my face against them. And I will make the earth a desolate area, simply because they committed a betrayal of trust, declares my Master, His Majesty. A couple of chapters later, in Ezekiel chapter 17, Ezekiel presents a riddle that can be a bit difficult to understand if one does not know the things I have written over the years, in regard to corporate Israel, and also have insight into the fact that the prophets depict men as both trees and vines. The prophet gives you all of the clues you need to understand what he says, but you have to pay close attention to detail, if you really want to understand the point of the riddle. Let's see if you are up to the task. Ezekiel chapter 17, verses 1 through 24, my interim translation. Then the word of His Majesty came to me, saying, Son of Adam, pose a riddle and make a comparison concerning the house of Israel, and say, This is what my Master, His Majesty, has said. The huge griffin vulture, the wings, were huge, the flight feathers, long, the plumage that he had, full of various beautiful colors, came to the Lebanon mountain range and took the pinnacle of the cedar. He plucked the top of its suckers, and brought him to the land of traders. He placed him in a city of merchants. Then he took some of the seed of the land and put it in a field of the seed that he took. He placed it as a willow beside many waters. Then it sprouted and became a low sprawling vine, its leafage rising up to turn back toward itself, and its roots were under it. So it became a vine and made separate parts and sent out leafy branches. But there was another huge griffin vulture, huge wings and a lot of plumage. And guess what? This vine bent its roots toward him, and sent out its leafage from the terraces of the place he planted it, for him to water it. It had been transplanted into a good field with many waters to make limbs and to bear fruit, to become a splendid vine. Say, This is what my Master, His Majesty, has said. Will it be successful? Will he not snap its roots and strip off its fruit, so that it dries up, so that every consumable thing of its sprout dries up, so as never, by a huge arm or by many people, to be raised up from its roots? So guess what? It had been transplanted. Will it be successful? Will it not dry up as soon as the spirit of the east wind makes contact with it? It will dry up on the terraces where it sprouted. Then the word of His Majesty came to me, saying, Please say to the rebellious house, do you not know what these things mean? Say, guess what? The king of Babylon came to Jerusalem and took her king and her princes and brought them to himself in Babylon. Then he took one of the royal seed and cut a legal agreement with him and brought him under oath. Then he took the rams of the land, so that the kingdom would be low, so as to not elevate itself, to stand watch over his legal agreement so that it would stand. But he rebelled against him by sending his messengers to Egypt, so that he would give him horses and many people. Will he be successful? Will the one who does these things escape? And can he make a legal agreement null and void and escape? I swear on my life, declares my Master, His Majesty, he will most definitely die in the midst of Babylon, in the place of the king who made him king, the one whose oath he despised and whose legal agreement he made null and void. But Pharaoh, with a huge entourage and a congregation of many, will not make it happen for him by war, by pouring out a ramp and building a siege wall to cut off many souls. Now he despised an oath so as to make a legal agreement null and void, and guess what? He gave his hand, then did all these things, he will not escape. Therefore, this is what my Master, His Majesty, has said, I swear on my life, I will most definitely put my oath, which he despised, and my legal agreement, which he made null and void, on his head. So I will spread my netting over him, then he will be taken hold of by my loop snare. Then I will bring him to Babylon, and I will judge him there, concerning the betrayal of trust that he committed against me, but all his choicest men among all his troops will fall by the sword, and those who are left as a remnant will be laid out by every spirit. Then you will know that I, His Majesty, have spoken. This is what my Master, His Majesty has said. Then I will take from the esteemed pinnacle of the cedar, and I will give a delicate one from the top of his suckers. I will pluck and transplant him on a high and towering mountain. I will transplant him on a mountain, the highest point of Israel, so that he bears limbs and makes fruit and becomes a majestic cedar. Then every bird, every winged creature, will reside under him. They will reside in the shadow of his leafage. Then all the trees of the field will know that I am His Majesty. I bring down a tall tree, I exalt a low tree, I dry up a moist tree, and I make a dried up tree blossom. I am His Majesty. I have spoken, and I will do it. Ezekiel sums up the point of that passage in the final 3 verses, but before he does that, he makes sure we have all the information the people of his day needed to know. Since you are not one of those, you have undoubtedly missed some of the points he makes. Here are the most obvious. 1. The first griffin vulture is the king of Babylonia. 2. The second griffin vulture is the king of Egypt. 3. The cedar is the royal dynasty of David. 4. The first pinnacle of the cedar is the king of Judah. 5. The vine is the collective members of corporate Israel. 6. The second pinnacle of the cedar is Jesus Christ. Knowing that, you should also know why Jesus quoted just a part of what Ezekiel wrote when he depicted himself parabolically as the kingdom of corporate Israel. Matthew chapter 13, verses 31 and 32, HSSB. He set another comparison before them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is just like a grain of mustard that a man, after accepting it, sowed in his field, the grain that, on the one hand, is smaller than all the seeds, but on the other hand, when it has been made to grow, is larger than the cultivated plants and becomes a tree, with the result that the winged creatures of heaven come and make a nest in its branches. Mark chapter 4, verses 30 through 32, HSSB. And he was saying, how should we liken the kingdom of the living God, or with what comparison should we put it down? Like a grain of mustard that, when it has been sowed on the earth, is smaller than all the seeds that are on the earth. Yet when it has been sowed, it comes up and becomes larger than all the cultivated plants, and it produces large branches, with the result that the winged creatures of heaven can make a nest under its shadow. Luke chapter 13, verses 17 through 19, HSSB. And while he was saying these things, all who were opposed to him were embarrassed, and the whole crowd was rejoicing over all the glorious things that were being done by him. Therefore, he was saying, just what is the kingdom of the living God like, and to what should I liken it? It is just like a grain of mustard that a man, after accepting it, put in his own garden, and it grew and turned into a tree. Then the winged creatures of heaven made a nest in its branches. My point in showing you all these things is to make sure you understand the church did not replace corporate Israel, not at all. The Jews in the time of Christ were cut off from corporate Israel through the ministry of John the Baptist, until only one member of corporate Israel remained. He thereby became corporate Israel in and of himself. The only good news in that message is, after God cut off all the other Jews from corporate Israel before he made him endure the agony of death on a cross, and then sent him to hell to endure all the curses of the Old Covenant, in order to atone for the sins of all the other members of corporate Israel both past and present. The Jews in the time of Christ were given the opportunity to be grafted back into corporate Israel just as the Apostle Paul tells us in Romans 11. He plainly states the case in regard to that reality, when he says the Jews have been cut off, and have to be grafted into the tree that corporate Israel, Jesus Christ, is before they can participate in God's plan for that corporate body. Romans chapter 11. Verses 1 through 27, HSSB. Therefore I say, has the living God not repudiated his people? Certainly not. For I am also an Israelite, one of Abraham's seed, of Benjamin's tribe. The living God has not repudiated his people, whom he knew before. Or are you not aware of what the scripture says about Elijah when he was filing a petition with the living God against Israel? Your Majesty, they killed your prophets, they demolished your sacrificial altars, and I have been left alone as a small remnant, and they are seeking my soul. But what does the divine communication say to him? I have left behind for myself 7,000 men who have not bent a knee to Baal. So also, therefore, at the present time there has also come to be a remnant in accordance with their choice of a favor. But if salvation is by a favor, it is no longer on the basis of works, otherwise the favor would no longer be a favor. What therefore? Israel has not gained possession of this thing that it is diligently seeking. The one who is his choice has now gained possession of it. But the rest of the members of Israel have been turned to stone, just as it has been written, the living God gave them a spirit of deep sleep, eyes that cannot see, and ears that cannot hear, up to the day today. And David says, let their table be turned into a snare and into a trap, even into a deadfall trap and into payback to them. Let their eyes be darkened, so that they cannot see, and bend their back down at all times. Therefore I say, did they not trip so that they fell? Certainly not. But the salvation for the Gentiles is because of their transgression, so as to make them jealous. But if their transgression is the world's wealth, and their failure, the Gentiles' wealth, how much more will their fullness be? But I am speaking to you, the Gentiles. Therefore, for as long as I am an apostle of Gentiles, I do, in fact, glorify my service, if somehow I could make my flesh jealous and save some of them. For if his scrapping of them is the world's reconciliation, what is their admission if not life from those who are dead? But if the first fruit is holy, the lump is also, and if the root is holy, the branches are also. But if some of the branches were broken off, and then you, who are a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them and became a fellow partaker of the sap of the root of the olive tree, do not speak derisively about the branches. But if you are speaking derisively about them, you are not carrying the root, but the root is carrying you. Therefore, you will say, branches were broken off so that I could be grafted in. Well said. They were broken off because of their lack of belief in God's promise, but you stand because of your belief in God's promise. You must not have your mind set on thoughts that are impressive, but be afraid, for if the living God did not spare the branches that are in accordance with nature, neither will he spare you. Therefore, take a look at God's benevolence and harshness. On the one hand, harshness for those who fell, but on the other hand, God's benevolence for you, if you stay there in his benevolence, since you could also be cut off. But even those individuals, if they do not stay there in their lack of belief in God's promise, will be grafted in, for the living God is able to graft them in again. For if you, those who are, in accordance with nature, part of the wild olive tree, were cut off and, contrary to nature, grafted into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these individuals who are in accordance with nature be grafted into their own olive tree? For I do not want you, brothers, to not understand this mystery so that you are not sensible in yourselves. Because a hardening of a part in Israel has occurred until the time when the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Then just as it has been written, all Israel will be saved in this way, the one who delivers will come from Zion, he will turn those who are depraved away from Jacob. And this is the testament from me for them, when I take away their sins. Anyone who has not been completely blinded by the lies of Satan should be able to understand that, when Paul uses the verbs translated, broken off, and cut off, he is using the Hebrew idiom, cut off from, to refer to the fact that God had cut off all the Jews save one, from corporate Israel, leaving Jesus as the remnant of the sons of Israel. Unfortunately, the truth regarding that, is just as Jesus stated it in this passage. John chapter 12, verses 20 through 50, HSSB. Now some of those who were going up, so that they could pay homage during the feast, were Greeks. Therefore, these individuals approached Philip, who was from Bethsaida of Galilee, and were asking him, saying, Master, we want to see Jesus. Philip comes back and tells Andrew. Andrew and Philip come back and tell Jesus. So Jesus responds to them, saying, The hour has come, so that the Son of the Man may be glorified. Without doubt I tell you, if the grain of wheat that has fallen onto the earth does not die, he is going to continue on alone, but if he dies, he is going to bear a lot of fruit. The one who is fond of his soul is going to do away with it, and the one who hates his soul in this world will keep it for life eternal. If anyone is going to serve me, he must follow me, then wherever I am, the servant that I have will be there also. If someone serves me, my Father will honor him. Now my soul has become disturbed, so what should I say? Father, save me from this hour. But I have come to this hour for this reason. Father, glorify your name. Therefore, a voice came out of heaven, I have both glorified my name, and I will glorify my name again. Therefore, the crowd that was standing around, and heard what was said, was saying that there had been rolling thunder. Others were saying, a messenger spoke to him. Jesus responded and said, This voice did not come for me, but only for you. The sentencing of this world is now, the ruler of this world will be thrown out now. Also, if I am elevated from the earth, I will drag everyone to myself. But he was saying this, indicating what kind of death he was going to die. Therefore, the crowd responded to him, We have heard from the law that the Anointed One is going to continue on into the age to come, so how can you say that the Son of the Man has to be elevated? Who is this individual, the Son of the Man? Therefore, Jesus told them, The light is going to be among you a short span of time more. As long as you have the light, walk so that darkness cannot grasp you. The one who is walking around in the darkness is not even aware of where he is going to go. As long as you have the light, believe God's promise about the light, so that you become sons of light. Jesus spoke these things and, after going away, hid from them. Even then, after he had done so many signs in front of them, they did not believe God's promise about him, so that the word of Isaiah the prophet, what he said, would be fulfilled. Your Majesty, who has believed the news we have? And to whom has the arm of His Majesty been revealed? For this reason they could not believe God's promise, because Isaiah said again, He blinded their eyes and turned their heart to stone, so that they would not see with their eyes, and understand with their heart, and turn around and I would heal them. Isaiah said these things because he saw His glory and talked about Him. Nevertheless, however, even a lot of the rulers believed God's promise about Him, but because of the Pharisees they were not acknowledging it, so that they would not be expelled from the synagogue, for they loved the glory of men more than, a lot more than, the glory of the living God. So Jesus shouted to them and said, The one who believes God's promise about me does not believe God's promise about me, but God's promise about the one who sent me, and the one who observes me observes the one who sent me. I came into the world as a light, so that anyone who believes God's promise about me would not remain in the darkness. So if anyone hears the statements I make and does not guard them, I am not going to judge him, for I did not come so that I could judge the world, but only so that I could save the world. The one who disregards me and does not accept the statements I make, has the thing that is going to judge him, the word that I have spoken. That word will judge him on the last day, because I have not spoken of my own accord, but the Father who sent me, He has given me a commandment, what I should say and what I should speak. And I am aware that His commandment is eternal life. Therefore, I am speaking the things that I am speaking this way, just as the Father told me. The parabolic image in which Christ is the light of the living Word of God comes directly out of the Passover parable. It depicts the truth that God stated in Scriptures as a light that comes on when someone believes it. So to those who read the things I have written and choose not to believe them, I say exactly the same thing that Jesus said about those who chose not to believe the truth in His day. Matthew chapter 15, verses 12 through 14, HSSB. At that time, after His disciples approached, they say to Him, Are you aware that the Pharisees were offended when they heard the word? So, in response, He said, Every plant that my heavenly Father did not plant will be uprooted. Leave them alone. They are blind guides of those who are blind. So if a blind man guides a blind man, both of them will fall into a pit. The Apostle Paul uses the same parabolic imagery to say the same thing when he says the following. You can believe it if you care to, disbelieve it if you dare to. It makes no difference to me one way or the other. I'm just doing what God called me to do. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 1 through 6, HSSB. For this reason, just as we have been shown mercy, we who have this service do not get discouraged. But we who are not walking in dishonesty, nor counterfeiting the word of the living God, but commending ourselves to every man's conscience in the sight of the living God by our disclosure of the truth, have renounced their shameful secrets. So even if the good news of the fulfillment of the promise we have is covered, it is covered in those who are being done away with, those in whom the God of this current age has blinded the thoughts of those who do not believe God's promise, so that they cannot distinctly see the illumination of the good news of the fulfillment of the promise of the glory of the Anointed One, who is the image of the living God. For we do not preach ourselves, but only His Majesty, Jesus, the Anointed One, and then ourselves as your slaves for Jesus. Because the living God who said, "A light will shine out of nether darkness," is the one who has shone in our hearts with an illumination of the knowledge of the truth concerning the glory of the living God on the face of Jesus, the Anointed One. My point is, there are some who can see the truth in what I teach, but others, the vast majority, do not have the ability to see, because they have not been enlightened. John chapter 1, verses 9 through 13, HSSB. The light was the real light, the one who provides light for every man who comes into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being via him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own did not take him to themselves. So then to as many as accepted him, to them, to those who believe God's promise about his name, he gave authority to become God's children, those who were not engendered by blood, or by the will of flesh, or by the will of man, but were only engendered by the will of God.